So here's a way of thinking about the distinction between different kinds of moral significance on Singer's view. So first, think of there being all sorts of different things that are good that we can rank so that the most important things are at the top. Being alive obviously is the most important thing when it comes to stuff that's good for you, because, well, if you're not alive, you can have stuff be good for you. And going all the way down through, just ordinary, everyday things like having good food, having good coffee, and then things that aren't really important to you at all, just the things that you're going to get rid of anyways. Now, this is a little bit misleading in several ways. For one, these are kind of general, described generally. These are particular things, but that's not going to matter so much for the way that we're going to draw the line here. So the idea is that some things have moral significance, other things do not. All of this stuff is stuff that if you have them, or maybe not that, but if you have them, it's better to have the stuff that's higher and higher up. So if you don't have good coffee, if you only have bad coffee, you're not going to be terribly happy. It's a sacrifice, right? So it is worse to not have good coffee, but it's not like a big enough deal that from an impartial moral point of view, we actually care about that. So the way you can think of moral significance is as the sort of things that impact your well-being. Okay? And to impact your so well-being is a sort of measure, but of sort of how well off you are, but it's kind of spread out across time. So your well-being isn't sort of going to be made greater or lesser, really, at very small points in time. So in other words, if you don't get something that you want right now, as long as it's not a huge deal, it's not, like a job or something like that, you're not going to be as well off. You're going to be less happy. But it's not really an impact on your well-being unless somehow it only impacts your well-being if it's at a more general level, at least at a more sort of across time level. So, for example, one way of thinking about it is just a simple test where we say something is negatively impacting your well-being something is negatively impacting your well-being if it is the sort of thing that would make your week worse. So, we wouldn't say that your week is been ruined just by the fact that you have... I really don't like this camera. What just happened? There you go. Your week is ruined just because you had bad coffee today. It just doesn't make sense, right? If you came home and said, oh yeah, my week was terrible, and somebody's like, well, why was your week terrible? And you said, well, school was good, friends, everything was fine, except I had some really bad coffee on Tuesday, and that just ruined my entire week. For most people, that doesn't make sense. So those are the kind of things that don't have moral significance, the kind of things that if you don't have them, sure, you're not as happy, but it doesn't really impact your well-being. So stuff like coffee and the quality of it is going to be on that list, the list of things that do not have moral significance. So all of the stuff down here has no moral significance, right? Now, on Singer's second version of his argument, remember, he's saying that we're morally required to give the things that have no moral significance. Well, this is what things he's talking about. Anything that is not significant enough to have an impact on your well-being, those are the sorts of things you can be obligated to give away. So the question is, though, when we're talking about the first version of his argument, we want to know what it is to have comparable moral significance. Because remember, he says, you know, when we're asking whether or not to save people from suffering and dying, we can be obligated to give away anything that isn't of comparable moral significance. So what that means is, you can think of it as there being different, you know, these things are on different levels, right? The worst possible thing is if you die. Because if you're dead, nothing can be good for you at all, right? And it's a pretty bad thing if you are losing large amounts of comfort. If you don't have some sort of comfort in your life, then that's going to be a pretty big hit to your well-being. But nowhere near as big a hit to your well-being if you have chronic disease or if you're dead. So when Singer's talking about comparable moral significance, what he's talking about is this. He's giving you a kind of criteria for what kinds of things you can be obligated to give that depends on what's at stake. So in the argument we've been talking about, Singer's talking about, we've been assuming that we're talking about saving people from who are at risk of dying right now. So in other words, the stakes are life and death. So when we're talking about comparable moral significance, for that argument, these are the only things that are going to be as morally significant. So the things that you can be obligated, the things that you cannot be obligated to give up are the things that are on a par with life and death. So you can't be obligated to give up your own life in order to save someone on this argument, if you buy that, if you're going to take that distinction. But you could be obligated to give up a very large amount of your own comfort. Or even, you could be obligated to go hungry for a bit. Maybe not for a long period of time, but if you had to go for only 2 meals a day for a month in order to save someone's life, well, your malnutrition and the kind of ill health that's causing, those kind of things are not as important as life and death. But the level of the sort of things that count as comparably morally significant is going to depend on what we are, what's at risk, what we are trying to prevent. So if, is more realistic, we are talking about preventing people from suffering chronic diseases or chronic malnutrition, as they do in lots of the world. The sorts of things that we can be obligated to give up get smaller, because there's less and less things that are as comparably morally significant. So, did I put that the right way? Yeah, there's less things that are going to be the sorts of things that you can't give up. So before, remember, it said that you're obligated to give up pretty much, when the stakes were here, you're obligated to give up anything that's not a matter of life or death, really. Remember, Singer has that whole caveat about marginal utility and stuff that brings it back a bit. But in principle, the goods that we're talking about are anything that doesn't rise to that level. But if we're just talking about malnutrition and stuff, then you can be obligated to give up a lot of your comfort. But you can't be obligated to give up, your food, because that would be giving up something of comparable moral significance, right? So the distinction between the two versions of Singer's argument is that on the first and the stronger version of his argument, what you're obligated to give up are anything that is not of comparable moral significance to the sorts of things that are at stake. So if what we're talking about is saving people's lives, then only things that matter for life and death have comparable moral significance. On the second version of his argument, we are only obligated to give up the things that have no moral significance. And so that's everything that's going to be below this line.